So welcome. Welcome to this Conscious Leadership in Action podcast. I'm Dr. Paul Ward, your host. I'm a leadership coach. I'm director at the Global Center for Conscious Leadership and the author of the book, The Inner Journey to Conscious Leadership. And the title of today's podcast is Conscious Leadership, So Much More Than Recycling, with guest Eric Kaufmann. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Paul.
So the purpose of this Conscious Leadership in Action podcast is to advance conscious leadership for the greater good of humanity. Now, we have many definitions of consciousness, and mindfulness features in many of those definitions. So let's begin today with a moment of mindfulness, calling on the universe, our higher power, source, spirit, whatever works for you, but calling there to guide our conversation today. So close your eyes if you wish, or soften your gaze. Let's just take 3 deep cleansing breaths together to bring us present to whatever wants to emerge today. All right, so let me take a moment to introduce our guest today, Eric Kaufmann. So Eric is the CEO of Sagatica, an executive development firm he's been running since 1999. Eric's also the author of The 4 Virtues of a Leader and Leadership as a Hero's Journey. Eric's a thought leader at Harvard's Institute of Coaching. And Eric's a TED speaker. Courage is not what you think. And if you haven't seen that TED talk, I encourage you to take Courage is Not What You Think, plug it into your search engine, and it'll pop up. It's a wonderful TED talk, just 17 minutes, just sharing Eric's experience in the mountains. And I just loved it. So if you haven't seen that, I just encourage you to go and find Eric's TED talk. Eric's a meditation practitioner since 1986. He's a native of Israel. And these are his words: father of 2 luminous women and a husband of 1 luminous wife. It's a wonderful way of describing family. So thank you very much. And thank you, Eric, for being with us today.
My pleasure, Paul. Truly, I appreciate this practice that you're bringing forward to expand and extend conscious leadership beyond you and I in conversation to a broader audience. So I really appreciate that.
Good. Thank you. So just tell us a little bit about your journey to conscious leadership.
I was born conscious, connected as an infant. That I think all of us are. Mm-hmm. And I proceeded to lose it in the course of school and teenage years, and sort of the connection that we come in when I have 2 daughters, and I've seen many infants, right? And a born infant, when I look into their eyes, I'm not sure that they're self-conscious, but there is the vastness of life peering back through those beautiful eyes of an infant. And then we go through this process of solidifying our sense of self and cultivating our identity and finding our place in society. And so that connection gets lost. And then I grew up in Israel, as you mentioned, and I came to the States to go to college. And one of the seminal events for me early on in my life was that I was essentially kicked out of college within a year of getting to the States. And so I found myself 19 years old on a student visa in a foreign country without any legal reason to be here. And that was not necessarily a conscious, but it was a real wake-up call, like, hey man, what you're doing is not working.
Right.
And so I was about 19, and I thought, oh my God, like, how do I get my life together? Mm-hmm. I was partying. I'm not going to get into detail, but it takes a lot to get kicked out of college in 1985, where it was pretty lenient. So I started reflecting by necessity, not necessarily because I wanted to, but I wanted to stay in America and I wanted to, get back into college. And so I thought, what's up? And I had a couple of interesting mentors who basically helped point the finger at, the problem is not out there, the problem is in here. And that if I can get my mind and heart to settle down, I could actually study and bring my native intelligence to bear and be successful. And so in short order, I looked around and what would do that, and found a meditation practice and a meditation community that that really captured my attention in many ways, both the attention of my searching heart and the way to pay attention as a matter of being. And so, so I moved into an actual commune. I lived in this community for what ended up being 12 years. And in those 12 years, I got back into college. I went to work. I got jobs. I worked at some big Fortune 100 companies, and was blending both sort of a very intensive spiritual practice. We'd wake up at 5 a.m. and meditate and take turns making breakfast and cleaning up, etc. And then I'd go to work and do my thing, and then I'd come back and we'd have lectures and meditations. And that went on for a dozen years. And I realized at some point in my early 30s that it was too much. I had to choose one or the other. And I chose to leave corporate, leave the work world, and completely immerse myself in the spiritual world. And so I did. I left. I went and built a cabin in the woods. I went to a very long retreat. And in that retreat, that was the intent, to sort of deepen my spiritual life and make that the norm. I had this revelation that I would grow more and I would learn more as a human being, as a spiritual being, with wife, children, and service to community.
How long were you in this cabin in the woods?
A year.
A year, wow.
Yeah, it was a year-long retreat in isolation, and the revelation blew me away, right? Because I had given away all my money, I'd shaved my head, I had no possessions, I had no job, I had no plans other than to meditate for the rest of my life. Suddenly, this revelation was: get married, have children, serve community. And so, for the past 20. How long has it been now? 21 years, I guess. Yeah. Since then, I have, in fact, done that. I came back, got married, had luminous, beautiful women that are in my life. And for the past 20 years, it's been cultivating this practice of coaching and executive development with a focus on consciousness.
Very good. Very good. And this whole idea of conscious leadership, why is it something that we should really be paying attention to now, particularly at a time when, in business particularly, it's all about competition, it's all about winning? Why is conscious leadership important today?
It's there's a couple ways to look at why it's important today, right? So one is to look at it's important today from a business valuation, sort of, in particular in the developed worlds. So we can have a conversation about the developing worlds, but in particular in the developed countries, right? The sort of decades of relative luxury that we've been living in the developing world has yielded a generation of workers who are suddenly recognizing that just money is not motivating enough, and purpose and connection is something bigger. So conscious leaders, from a business perspective, inherently then become more attractive to the kind of high level, intelligent, heart-centered talent that would like to work in environments that are more conscious, right? So there's kind of that domain. There's the kind of inevitability of what's happened over millennia, not just generations, but millennia, where the influence has shifted from church and God directing human society and morality, to government and law directing society and morality, to essentially business have become, and business leaders having become the de facto, unintentional, unaware leaders of human society and shapers of culture. And so conscious leadership is critical because business is no longer just about profit, it is in fact about culture. And so that is a mantle of responsibility that we have to awaken folks to take on, to bear. And then, the third reason is that there's a sort of a crisis we're facing as population grows, as resources are scarce, as people are scrambling to try and deal with environmental conditions where we cannot just imagine ourselves living in isolated bubbles, but we have to understand the interconnectedness of all of life and serve that as leaders. And that's one of the fundamental notions of what it means to be conscious, is to be aware of the interconnectedness of all things.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And you had suggested the title for our podcast, our conversation today, about conscious leadership being more than just recycling. So say a bit more about why that title.
I was mentioning this to you last time we spoke, and I've come to make a distinction, as it were, of two types of approaches to conscious leadership. And there's what I've now come to call conscious leadership, and there's what I call conscientious leadership. And so what does it mean to be conscientious? It means to do the right thing, right? To do the right thing, recycling, diversity, inclusion, fair trade, those are all things that's the right thing to do. And I applaud that. And recycling is really critical. The environment's critical. Treating people fairly is critical. But I think there's a distinction, right? Conscious. To me, to be conscious means to be in an unresisting awareness of the present moment and the interconnectedness of all things. Right. So that's what it means to me. To be conscious means to be an unresisting awareness of the present moment and the interconnectedness of all of life. And so I could recycle, but be really hard-hearted. I could recycle, but be so competitive in my behavior that I am diminishing the well-being of the people around me. I could recycle, but still, harbor great jealousy and insecurity, and therefore be critical and sarcastic towards people on my team. So recycling is wonderful, but to me, that's not really what conscious leadership is about. Conscious leadership is about the individual awakening their consciousness and expanding beyond the ego construct of I am this to a life-centered construct, which says, here's how we're all connected.
Yes, this idea of awareness is, for me, really important, that we really are paying attention. And paying attention to all of the aspects. And so, much more than just recycling, it's much more than that. For me, it's about being aware, noticing what's going on, and then also setting an intention about how we want to show up in the world. Because if we have an intention to show up with compassion, with attention, with care, all those good words, and some would say feminine values for us males to be attentive to, then if we have an intention to show up with that, in that way, then whatever comes up, whatever it is, whether it is recycling or whether it is the political area, or if it's business, wherever it is, if we have that intention to show up in that way, we can become more conscious, and then we can act more responsibly.
I absolutely love what you're saying. I love that you brought up this idea that these values that we're promoting are more feminine values. As a guy who grew up in a military environment, as a guy who has never been really mistaken for feminine, I get what you're saying, and I think there's real power in that. And I think, in fact, that we're getting to what does it really mean to practice being conscious, right? Yeah. And so I'll just, briefly describe, as I've learned, some of the beautiful distinction in feminine, masculine, right? And so imagine for a moment, two triangles, an upward and a downward pointing triangle, right? The upward point triangle is classically the masculine. It's the masculine energy that rises up, right? And there are 3 points on that triangle, and we'd call them presence, claim, and penetration. The masculine energy, whether it's male or female, whether it's a man or a woman, is not there. It's the masculine energy, right? Presence is showing up. Claim is, this is what I stand for. And penetration is moving through, right? So it's not just about sex. It's about being in the world in a masculine form. The feminine triangle, sort of pointing down, corresponds and complements that. And it has invitation, surrender, and inclusion, right? So if there's presence, there's got to be invitation, right? If I'm going to show up, there's got to be the invitation. If there's going to be claim, there's got to be surrender. And if there's going to be penetration, there's got to be inclusion. And the issue about being a conscious leader is not, are you being feminine? That's a non-starter kind of 19th century misinterpretation of what it means to be in the spiritual realm. The question is, can you grow, to your point, in awareness to recognize when it's time for penetration or claim and when it's time for surrender and invitation, right? Can you, in the moment, be aware enough of the gestalt of experience to respond appropriately as masculine or feminine, not in your sexuality, which is this most sort of obvious version of it, but in your expression, behavior, and relationship. And I think that takes conscious leadership into a place where I am aware in real time of the interconnectedness of all things, and how do I show up, respond, contribute, and make a difference in the space.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that, those distinctions. And, I do think it's much more about feminine and masculine values and the energy. That's going to be a shift for a lot of people, to shift away from just talking about the feminine and the masculine, but think about the energy and then the values, and that we can all, and perhaps, particularly the males and the men in the business, can just be a little bit more conscious of, again, how we show up and how it's not a case of throwing out the masculine energy, the masculine values. It's about complementing with the feminine values and the feminine energy.
Yeah, and you're right. It's a shift. It's a shift in consciousness.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's not just to be more conscious, but of this or of that, but it's to grow in the general sense of, am I locked into my conditioning? Because that is, to some degree, the opposite of conscious, right? I'm locked into my conditioning. That's classically unconscious. Right? I am not at will, at choice, aware in present time of my decisions, choices, and behaviors and relationships. I am simply behaving in a way that is a momentum, a continuation of what I've been taught and told. Mother, father, church, and state, right? Our conditioning, our parents, our culture, our religion, that conditions us. And I think this, to your point, the shift is for us as leaders to grow beyond that conditioning, to hold a bigger container in a space, and not just to sort of understand that it's okay to be feminine or masculine, but really to be able to, in real time, allow the life force that wants to come through to express itself through us. We become a vessel as well as a guide for the energy.
Yeah. Good.
And so, if I may, I'm sitting in a meeting, right? For example, I'm in a meeting. I'm an executive in a meeting. There's a bunch of people in the room, and in the moment, one of the folks in the team brings up an objectionable idea. Objectionable to me, objectionable to the rest of the people, because it's taking the conversation in a direction that is different than what we've all agreed on already. In that moment, I can feel that kind of energy rising, right? Oh shit, don't go there. I don't want to hear this. And I could just, by my conditioning, instead of being curious and attentive, I'm in certainty and conditioning, shut it down. Yeah. And I say, damn, that's not appropriate. We're not going to deal with that now. Or I can sort of sit back because I've been meditating and I'm more conscious. I'm aware of the bigger container. And I can feel into my body and say, wow, there's part of me that really doesn't want to have this objectionable conversation. But I think there's a kernel of truth in what Dan is saying. So let me lean in and say, okay, everyone, hold on a second. Dan, expand on that.
Right.
And Dan brings an idea that suddenly enriches the conversation in a way that we were stuck in our echo chamber of ideas. Dan is bringing something new. That's conscious leadership.
Yeah.
That's conscious leadership in the moment, to not be the bully or the sort of the leader or the general who's shutting Dan down because he's out of line with the troop, but the curious sage who's saying, ooh, I feel something here. Say more. That's practical. It's not just philosophical.
Yeah, I love that example. That's great. What are the other examples maybe of how a conscious leader or how a leader on a day-to-day basis can foster their conscious leadership?
On a day-to-day basis, I mean, I'm a big believer in the practice of meditation. Mm. And so, and I know you are as well, and I know many of our circle of friends and colleagues are, and there's a reason for that. I think that what meditation practice, after doing it now for 33 years, what it boils down to for me is a particular way of listening. When I'm meditating, when I meditated this morning, right, I'm sitting there and I'm paying attention in real time with curiosity and trying to suspend judgment, right? I'm listening. What am I listening for? It doesn't matter. I don't know. But I'm listening to what's happening in my body, what's happening in the environment, what's happening in my mind, what's happening beyond, right? And then I'm not in judgment. So imagine that when I walk into a meeting. Imagine that when you're connecting with another person. Imagine that in a sales meeting. So I think meditation is a big deal because it allows us to be in tune. That's the same thing as listening, right? I'm listening for the tune. I'm in tune. So absolutely, I'm advocating for a daily practice of even 10 or 15 minutes of just sitting there. And there's so many different apps and tools, but meditate is one. I think that another very practical element is the practice of love, which we often don't talk about in this construct of conscious leadership. But if I take consciousness all the way to its sort of expanded state, there's the diminution of fear, which is my ego, and there's the emergence of love, which is a sense of connectedness and wanting to do well for others. So gratitude is huge.
Yeah.
A conscious leader practicing gratitude is not only because people like to be affirmed and recognized and they appreciate hearing gratitude, but think of what happens when I am being grateful to you. I have to reduce my own need for recognition and my own ego impulse. And in gratitude, I put my focus and attention on you and draw out what I see in you, recognizing that and inviting and invoking the best in you to keep coming forward. Right. Gratitude is a spiritual practice. It's a conscious practice of invoking the best. It's not just about the reciprocity of you. I'll say something nice about you, you say something nice about me. So really practically meditating in order to learn to really be attuned and listen, and being grateful as a practice of invoking the best out of others.
Yeah, both very important. And in terms of meditating, I often talk about, we started with a moment of mindfulness. I sometimes talk about a purposeful pause. You know, it's good to find 15 minutes of the day. You know, I live by the beach, and I often start, in fact, most mornings start on the beach walking to see the sunrise. And it's nice to be able to find that 15, 30 minutes of quiet. But sometimes it can be just a few seconds, a few moments to have, just as you were talking about going into a meeting, going just to have a conversation with someone, rather than just rush from one thing to the next, rush through the door, is, you know, as you hold the handle of the door, is just to pause 10 seconds. Sometimes that's all that's necessary, but a few breaths. And then walk in. It totally changes the way you show up for those conversations. Absolutely.
And I have a great, what's it called? A pet peeve. That's what they call it, right?
Yep.
We, at least in the United States, have made it normal to say, oh, I'm crazy busy. I'm crazy busy. And crazy busy is like a badge of honor, right? You are crazy busy general. This is just a crazy busy private. You know, the crazy busy you are, the more somehow important you are. What a freaking travesty, right? The crazy busy just basically leaves you crazy. And crazy is not the same thing as conscious.
Right.
And so to your point, these pauses allow us to move from a place of reactivity, conditioning, and being dispersed, right? I'm blown apart and my attention is floating around. So if conscious is, you know, an unresisting awareness of present moment and interconnection, then crazy busy is the opposite of conscious. Mm-hmm. And these purposeful pauses you're describing, I'm with you 100%, right? If I have a meeting to go to, right? I'm a manager and I'm going to go into a meeting, sit down for 2 minutes and just close your eyes and breathe. Regather yourself, reorient yourself to the present moment. And then before you get up, think of the intention. What's the highest and most valuable thing that I want to be able to experience or manifest in this meeting? 2 minutes. The fact that somebody's too crazy busy for 2 minutes is just an abdication of their responsibility as a leader. It's bullshit. Everybody's got 2 minutes. Go to the bathroom. But, you know, regather. Don't just come in there blown apart where your attention is just floating like stars in the cosmos. Come together like have a gravitational force and then set an intention. I think these purposeful pauses it's a game changer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even at the beginning of the meeting is something I've been practicing for a while, is when people gather, is again to find a moment. Maybe
I do 3 minutes. I do 3 minutes at the beginning of meetings,
Yep.
even with hard-boiled, executive teams. And we do it once or twice, and they go, and one time recently, I forgot to do the 3-minute pause, and the COO goes, what about the 3 minutes? Yeah, you like it. Because they're like 3 minutes to just sit quietly and get focused is fantastic.
Yeah. I do that with all of my leadership coaching too. It's always that start at the beginning because people rush into a meeting or jump on the phone or jump on a Zoom call.
Right.
And, they're still where they were. And
right.
So it's important to bring them into the conversation and to have that pause and as you say, people start to appreciate it once they get into it. They really appreciate it. So it's a valuable step. So, okay. So let's move to the other side of this. What are the barriers to becoming more conscious as a leader?
The three sort of big barriers are ignorance, greed, and hatred. And so you are doing a great job taking on the barrier of ignorance, right? The fact that people don't even know that that's an option is one form of ignorance. The other form of ignorance is that people do not understand the interconnectedness of all of life. And so when I'm sitting here thinking, it's just about me. It's about me. I'm a self-made man. I'm self-directed. I am, as one president in the election stood up and said, I alone can change everything, right? This notion of individual disconnectedness is a massive barrier to conscious leadership. So understanding how we are interconnected and looking for all the interconnections, here's this ring that I wear, right? How many thousands of people has it taken to get to the point where I can put this ring on my finger? Mm. Who dug the ore, made the design, created the tools with which to dig the ore, built the machines to haul the ore? You know what I mean? I can go on and on. But this ring represents thousands of, if not millions of people. It's interconnected. Right. The other barrier is greed, right? My own consistent need for being fulfilled and satisfied. It's not just food. It's recognition, it's power, it's control, it's it's love. And so really looking at how do I get to this place of generosity or love, or cultivating this capacity for being in a giving place, not just in the greedy place, all about me. And then hatred is all the things that I just don't like. We have all these opinions about, I hate this, I don't like this, I'm angry at this, I'm pissed at this, push this away. That's a barrier to consciousness because I'm forcing everything away. I'm not accepting and receiving it. So even if we look at where our greed and anger is and learn to mitigate that, we will grow in consciousness.
Yeah, and you surprised me a little with the word hatred. And part of that for me is I'm very into language. I grew up and still spend a lot of time in England, and I spend a lot of time in the US. And language is a challenge because we confuse each other. We don't always know what we say, and even worse when we don't have exactly the same English language.
Right.
But the word hate is something I very consciously would have avoided, and I think it would be fair to say that nobody would hear me say that. I hate this. It's just not in my vocabulary. And I think
but you're a conscious person who's done that intentionally, right?
Right.
I think that if you look around at our society, the notion of hate in its various shades, which is basically, I don't accept this and I want to get rid of it, right? So that can be, I hate that I have a cold, right? Or it can be, I hate the Democrats. Or it can be, I hate the immigrants that are taking away our jobs. I mean, it is this, essentially, hate is this sense of, I'm going to push away and try and get rid of something.
Yeah.
And that's, and language is powerful, right? But I think that is the emotion that undergirds many of these shades of resistance, pushing away anger, violence, that sort of emerges from that place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yes, England, America. I mean, I don't remember who said this was one of the famous authors, right? England and America, two countries divided by common language.
That's right. It was Winston Churchill in one of his speeches, actually, in the US. So yeah. Okay, good. So, in fact, we've sort of been looking there at some of the examples of unconscious leadership, and there are plenty. There are plenty. We only have to turn the TV on and find all sorts of examples of unconscious leaders. But who would you say, who would you cite as someone who really is a conscious leader? It may be someone we all know. It may be someone that, one of your clients that you wouldn't name, but just who it is,
Yeah.
maybe the description of this conscious leader.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not, the reason I'm not keen to name any sort of public names is I don't know them. And so if all I know is sort of the appearance on the media, then I am, that's not sufficient for me, right? So for me, it's the personal experience. And I have, David's a conscious leader, Matt's a conscious leader, Peter's a conscious leader, Paul's a conscious leader, Marilyn's a conscious leader, Kelly's, there's so many that I know who are the people that I work with who are conscious, and sort of why do I deign to call them a conscious leader, right? And I say they're conscious leaders because they're exhibiting sort of three consistent behaviors across the board. One is wisdom. Right? They're willing to look below the surface and beyond the obvious. And they're seeing the interconnectedness of all things, and they have a bigger perspective than just their own immediate, needs and drivers. The other is love. These folks all practice one form or another, a way of wanting to do well for others and for the bigger container, right? So they are practicing in such a way that cultivates the well-being all around them. That's love. And the third is courage. They're all willing to walk towards what they'd rather run away from, right? So they're not gonna retreat in fear. They're going to engage their fear and move forward in order to serve, to grow, and to unfold. And so this wisdom, love, and courage, when I see that in play, I see people who are playing into that space of conscious leader.
Yeah, I like that. I like that description. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about your own personal journey. I do encourage people to go and look at the video, the TED Talk, and also to read your books and things like that. But I'm just curious as to what's next for you on your journey.
What's next on my journey? What's next on my journey has been emerging for the past year and a half or so, and it has to do with the level of directness, like the conversation you and I are having is a service to me, and I really appreciate it because you are inviting me to come on camera and describe things that are meaningful to me personally and spiritually, and to do it. If I dial it back 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, my work was more veiled. I wanted to be more acceptable, less freakish, not wanting to be out there. And now I'm feeling this profound sense of both timing globally and personally to want to unleash and remove the veils. And so I'm speaking directly about, what's next for me is that what I'm truly believing is that this work of conscious leadership is a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
Right. And for so many years, we avoided the word spiritual. We got to call it all these different cute names. Right. But at some level, this is spiritual work, independent of whether you're Christian or Buddhist or Jewish or Jain or Muslim. It is a spiritual work. And what's next for me is to be unambiguous in bringing that forward and unafraid, because part of why I did it was my own fear. Would I be able to support my family? Will people think I'm a freak? I can't support my family and I am a freak. Facts done. Now I'll just be overt about it. So that's what's next.
Yeah, and as you said, I think in the TED Talk, we're always going to have that fear.
Yeah,
it's always going to be there. So it's acknowledging the fear and letting that drive our behavior too.
Yeah, and so what's next is I really want to. I am and I want to continue to be awakening influencers is what I want to do. I want to awaken influences to their spiritual connection and continues to connect my own spiritual connection too.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're just coming to the end of our time together today. You have one piece of wisdom for an aspiring conscious leader listening to our conversation today?
I mean, besides the last 40 minutes of trying to really, pull something meaningful into this space, one piece of wisdom. Oddly, I would say this, which I did not expect to say this. I would say if somebody's an aspiring conscious leader, somebody who wants to make this more of their life, find a community of folks that are doing this. doing this in a vacuum is challenging. And find a circle, a community, you know, a cohort of people that are oriented with the same intention and the same passion, because that feeds not only the soul but also the practice. You and Aaron are together, more than one, right? There are several communities, but don't do it alone. That's stupid. Find other people that are doing it. Learn from someone, band with other people, teach someone, but get in community.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. And one of the things I'm enjoying about doing these podcasts is, you know, connecting with people within our circle and beyond our circle. So it's a great piece of advice for us to create or build or join those communities. And as you and I are both doing that to a great extent. So thank you very much for your words of wisdom today. And thank you for being here. I really enjoyed our conversation. It seems to have rushed by. It always does. I'd just like to close just to remind those who are watching and listening that of who we are. And so I've got that on the screen. I'll remind people in a moment. But just before we close, I just wanted to talk about consciousness for me. Conscious leadership for me is about noticing what's going on. It's about setting intention. It's about acting responsibly. That's the way I like to look at it. There's so many different ways to look at it. There's no one answer. There's multiple answers. But if we can reach out, reach higher levels of consciousness, we can increase our confidence in ourselves, and that will lead us to greater success in our personal and professional lives. So I hope you'll live and lead more consciously as a result of our conversation today. Aspire to be a more conscious leader. And if you'd like to reach Eric, you can find him at sagatica.com, Sagatica. And his email is eric@sagatica.com. So Eric, ERIC at SAGATICA.com. So you can find Eric there. And you can find me at paul@drpaulward.net. And you can find the link to the book, The Inner Journey to Conscious Leadership, at theconsciousleadershipbook.com. So once again, thank you so much, Eric. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I know our listeners will. And to everybody, I look forward to seeing you. See you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.